The air was thick but silent. My name wasn't mentioned, at least not directly, but I could feel the weight of it pressing against every polished wall, every whispered conversation in the grand hall. They didn't see me, or they pretended not to. I was outside the velvet ropes, a ghost in my own family's gala, barred from a world that had been mine by blood and expectation. Every laugh, every clink of crystal carried a subtle accusation that I didn't belong. And yet, behind one carefully veiled glance, I glimpsed it. Someone hiding a truth so fragile that if I acknowledged it, it could unravel everything. Hours later, the first message arrived. The morning felt ordinary, almost too ordinary. Sunlight sifted through the blinds in thin, sharp lines across the polished floors of our townhouse, catching specks of dust that floated like tiny witnesses. I moved carefully through the quiet, the kitchen appliances humming in a rhythm I had long memorized. No one spoke my name. It wasn't necessary. I was visible enough to perform my duties, invisible enough to go unnoticed. That balance had always been there. I accepted it because I thought I understood my place. I thought I could trust it. Breakfast was the same as always. My mother skimmed the headlines while stirring her tea, her eyes flicking to me once in passing, enough to acknowledge I existed but not enough to invite conversation. My father, already half-dressed for meetings he claimed were crucial, barely looked up from his phone. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the edge of the table, careful not to disrupt the carefully choreographed rhythm. It was a pattern I knew well, a world I understood, everyone in control, me observing, noting, adapting. Even then, the dynamics were subtle but precise. Trust was measured in gestures, in the gaps between words. I trusted that my silence would be tolerated, that my competence in unnoticed tasks would go unchallenged. My parents relied on appearances, on the smooth operation of the systems they controlled. I fit quietly into those gaps, noting their habits, the way my father skimmed reports for numbers that mattered to him, the way my mother expected conversations to be more formal than warm, the way neither seemed to notice what I observed until it became useful to them. Later, I walked through the study, where shelves of leather-bound ledgers and awards reflected more than achievement. They reflected influence. I traced my fingers over the spines of books I had never read, artifacts of a life I belonged to but wasn't yet permitted to navigate. The trust I placed in their guidance was steady but tentative, built from years of careful observation. They assumed I absorbed lessons without question. They assumed I would not challenge boundaries. I went through the motions of my day. Emails were answered, calls were relayed, small tasks executed with precision. I watched the interactions around me, assistants exchanging coded glances, family friends leaning too close to my parents as they spoke, their words dripping with subtle deference. I cataloged it all in silence. I trusted that my place, my position, was stable, that I could predict reactions, anticipate outcomes, and navigate the invisible architecture of influence. Yet there were moments, fleeting and easy to dismiss, that prickled at my awareness. A conversation cut short when I entered a room. A whispered reference I could not parse fully, but felt behind me like a shadow. A subtle shift in tone when someone addressed my father directly in my presence, as if I were a variable in an equation they had not solved. I told myself these were coincidences, trivialities. I told myself I was reading too much into ordinary gestures. That was part of my trust, trusting that the world I saw was the world that existed. By mid-afternoon, the house had emptied. My parents had left for meetings, the staff bustling around in rehearsed efficiency. I lingered in the empty hallways, moving quietly, absorbing the subtle textures of their routines. Everything was in order. The power, the hierarchy, the unspoken rules, these were what I trusted. I trusted that I could observe without being observed, that I could measure influence without interference, that I could exist in the margins without consequence. And yet, as I stood by the window, watching a limousine pull into the driveway below, I felt the faintest tremor of unease. Not fear, not suspicion. Just a quiet note, barely audible, suggesting that the patterns I trusted were more fragile than I realized. I ignored it, letting the ordinary rhythm of the day lull me into comfort. The dinner table was familiar, predictable. The silverware polished, the plates perfectly aligned. My mother spoke of an upcoming gala, a family event she framed as important but vague. My father nodded at intervals, his attention split between details I could not access and a conversation with his lawyer on the phone. I listened, as always, taking in everything, participating enough to be present but never enough to draw attention. I trusted that my presence, my observation, and my quiet compliance were enough. That trust felt solid, unquestionable. Yet beneath it I knew, though I would not name it, that my place, my perceived stability, was dependent entirely on the unseen rules my parents and their associates enforced. I trusted the structure, but the structure was built for their convenience, not mine. That trust, I would learn, was already fragile. The gala had been mentioned casually at breakfast, but in the days leading up to it, the ordinary rhythm of my life began to feel off. Small things, almost imperceptible at first. Invitations whispered through the household in passing conversations I wasn't invited to. Names of guests I had never met, described in tones of familiarity I didn't share. My parents' schedules shifted without explanation, their casual references to decisions and arrangements creating gaps I could not fill. I felt the edges of exclusion before I could articulate why it mattered. The staff moved differently, too. Polished and precise as ever, but their attention now seemed layered, directed at invisible cues I couldn't see. I noticed glances exchanged over my shoulder, subtle nods when my parents spoke in rooms I had not entered. Nothing was overt, nothing could be confronted directly. Yet, even as I tried to dismiss it, the air carried a new weight, a tension I had never noticed before. I had always observed, catalogued, and understood. Now I realized I was reading signals designed to exclude me. I spent the morning reviewing my notes from previous family events, as I often did. Observing patterns, cataloging behaviors, understanding who wielded influence in ways I could not see. It had always been a quiet, intellectual exercise, one that gave me confidence. Today, it revealed inconsistencies I hadn't noticed before. A name mentioned casually by my mother was suddenly omitted in conversation the next day. My father referred to a guest as important in one room, but the same person was dismissed when mentioned in another. I made a note. I trusted my records more than their words. At dinner, the first explicit exclusion occurred. My mother discussed table arrangements for the gala, her words flowing over me as if I were part of the furniture. She spoke of who would sit next to whom, which investors needed attention, which alliances had to be nurtured, all without acknowledging that I was listening. I leaned back, keeping my expression neutral, letting the conversation wash over me. The realization stung more than words could describe. In this carefully orchestrated event, my presence wasn't considered relevant. My trust in my family's acknowledgement of me was beginning to fracture, and yet I remained composed, silent. Later, I tried to bring up a small question. Logistics, nothing more about the gala. My father waved it off. "Don't worry about it," he said without looking up from his phone. My mother smiled briefly but offered no answer. The dismissal was subtle but deliberate. My question, which I believed legitimate, was treated as irrelevant. My instincts flared quietly, internally, but I did not push. Observation was safer than confrontation. Restraint had always been my advantage. I noticed other details, too, almost trivial but unsettling. A brief hesitation when my father mentioned an investor's visit. An extra glance toward a staff member who looked at me as if I were an intruder. The house seemed to shift subtly, the familiar walls of trust bending just enough that I could feel it. I cataloged these moments carefully, aware that in isolation they might mean nothing, but patterns, I knew, were revealing. Even in my personal space, I felt subtle encroachment. Documents I had reviewed before were now moved slightly, notes rearranged, as if someone wanted to unsettle the order I had established. I resisted checking every detail obsessively, reminding myself that trust required discretion and observation required patience. Yet the unease persisted. It was no longer background noise. It was a pulse I could feel in the spaces between words, in the pauses of conversation, in the way people moved around me. By the evening, the sense of exclusion was undeniable. Invitations had arrived for distant cousins, family friends, and even business associates, but not for me. My mother's brief smile carried the weight of omission. My father's nod felt rehearsed, as if to remind me silently that my presence was optional, not expected. I sat in quiet reflection, sipping tea, cataloging every detail, every gesture, every omission. The discomfort was growing, but I maintained composure, careful not to betray the awareness I now carried. Even as I felt the first cracks forming in the world I had trusted, I clung to one truth. Observation was still my strength. I might be excluded, underestimated, ignored, but I could watch. I could record. I could wait. And in that quiet space, I began to sense that the small moments of unease were not accidents. They were deliberate. A faint edge of anxiety threaded through my awareness, subtle enough that most would not notice, yet sharp enough to remind me that my assumptions about trust were no longer reliable. The pattern was emerging, and I was determined to see it fully. Quietly, I braced myself. The morning started as if nothing had changed. The sun slanted through the blinds the same way. The polished floors reflected the dust motes drifting lazily in their familiar patterns. Yet I felt a shift, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself was alerting me. It was in the way my mother's voice softened when she spoke of the gala, the careful phrasing, the tiny pauses she allowed herself when glancing at my father. They were both performing, carefully curating an image I was not permitted to inhabit. I moved through the house with deliberate, quiet, cataloging details like always, but today the anomalies stood out. A folder on my father's desk, slightly askew, caught my attention. It was labeled with an event name I didn't recognize. He glanced at it once, then shut it quickly. My pulse didn't race, but awareness sharpened. Observation had always been my lens. Now it was my shield. I made a mental note, remembering that in their world, even the smallest slips could mean something significant. Later, during breakfast, a minor remark drew my attention. My mother referred to a guest as essential for decisions, then quickly amended herself with a vague, casual smile. The shift wasn't verbal. It was in tone, in the pause, in the way her eyes flicked toward the hallway before settling back on her cup. I caught it, and I recognized it for what it was. Information being filtered, partially revealed, intentionally incomplete. The red flag, small but clear, waved in silence. At the office within the house, my father's private study, I found more inconsistencies. A conversation I overheard between assistants suggested a seating arrangement that directly contradicted what my mother had described the night before. I had trusted their schedules, their words. Now I realized that trust had been conditional, contingent on my compliance and invisibility. The unease grew, subtle but persistent, like an itch I couldn't scratch. When I tried to ask a clarifying question, the dismissal was sharper than before. My father's hand waved vaguely. "Just trust the plan," he said. My mother offered a thin smile but no answer. It wasn't just dismissal, it was a subtle assertion of control. My perspective, my input, was no longer considered relevant. And the realization hit, I wasn't just overlooked. I was being deliberately excluded. The thought was quiet but heavy, settling in a place where denial had once lived. Throughout the day, small red flags kept appearing. A staff member avoided my gaze when passing a note to my mother. Documents I thought I had access to were now restricted, moved to a locked drawer, or quietly removed from my workspace. I cataloged each instance without reaction, my hands steady, my expression neutral. The pattern was forming clearly. This was not oversight. This was deliberate. Even the seemingly casual social interactions carried hidden signals. Invitations were whispered about in hallways, discussed in tones that suggested urgency, yet never extended to me. Conversations stopped when I entered, resumes of discussions I was never part of. It was all orchestrated to maintain a facade, to keep me out of the loop, to preserve a hierarchy I had assumed would include me. Every omission, every pause, every careful word became a red flag I could not ignore. By evening, the unease had grown into suspicion. I reviewed notes from past interactions, cross-referencing names, events, and patterns. It was no longer just discomfort. The inconsistencies were too deliberate, too frequent, too coordinated to be dismissed. I began to see threads of manipulation woven into familiar routines. They assumed my compliance, my silence, but I had been watching long enough to see the cracks forming. I didn't confront them. I didn't need to. Observation was more powerful than words, more revealing than questions. The subtle signals, the omissions, the calculated gestures, all of it spoke louder than any conversation I could force. I felt the quiet tightening of control around me, the invisible boundaries drawn by those I had once trusted implicitly. And yet, I remained calm. I cataloged every nuance, every slip, every half-truth. Suspicion had replaced comfort, but it had not replaced restraint. I had learned, over years of quiet observation, that power was revealed not in confrontation, but in consequences, in the gaps between words, in the patterns of behavior. And in those gaps, I began to trace the outlines of betrayal. By the time night fell, I could no longer ignore the red flags. They were everywhere, subtle but undeniable, weaving a map of exclusion and manipulation. Trust, I realized, had been conditional all along. The world I thought was stable had cracks. The question now was how deep those cracks went, and how far the people I trusted would go to hide the truth. The day started like any other, but the rhythm I had come to rely on had shifted in subtle ways I couldn't ignore. My questions, once acknowledged with cursory answers or polite nods, were now met with vague remarks, clipped tones, or laughter that didn't reach the eyes. I could feel the dismissal like a brush against my skin, light but persistent, leaving an unease I could not shake. I tried to trust myself, to catalog what I saw, but the emotional weight pressed against me with a quiet insistence. It began with small things, a misremembered conversation, my father correcting details I knew I had noted correctly, my mother insisting she had already explained this when I distinctly remembered being left out. I questioned myself briefly. Was I mistaken? Was I reading too much into subtle gestures, the uncertainty gnawed at the edges of my focus? I had learned over years that hesitation could be weaponized. They could make me doubt my own observations without ever raising their voices. By mid-morning, the pattern was unmistakable. During a family call with distant relatives and business associates, I asked a question about scheduling for the gala. My voice was calm, neutral, precise. My mother leaned back, a polite but deliberate smile plastered across her face. "Oh, dear," she said softly, almost amused. "You really don't understand how these things work." My father's eyes flicked to me briefly before returning to his documents, expression neutral. The implication was clear. My perspective was irrelevant. My understanding insufficient. My presence unnecessary. It wasn't just the dismissal, it was the subtle undermining of my perception of reality. Later, I found myself recounting details of a conversation only to be told it had never happened that way. When I insisted gently, I was met with laughter, a kind of patronizing amusement that suggested I was the one creating tension. I felt the familiar surge of internal awareness, the silent assertion that I was neither wrong nor mistaken, yet my external world was arranged to convince me otherwise. The staff mirrored this pattern. Instructions I had given, perfectly reasonable and necessary, were quietly ignored or corrected behind my back. When I confronted a minor error, the response was calm but loaded. "Perhaps you misunderstood." Even small mistakes were magnified, then deflected back as signs of my incompetence. It was exhausting, insidious. Every subtle gesture chipped away at my trust in what I knew to be true. At one point, a friend of the family called with questions about the gala. I answered with clarity, offering details I had observed and confirmed. When I repeated what I had seen to my parents later, they contradicted me entirely, insisting I had imagined the conversation. My own memories were rendered suspect, my awareness questioned. The gaslighting was quiet, strategic, a slow erosion of confidence. I felt the old rhythm of trust slipping, replaced by a growing pressure to second-guess everything. Even in private, the pattern persisted. I wrote notes meticulously, recorded timelines, cataloged gestures and words, but when I referenced them later, I was told they were overly detailed or unnecessary. My careful observations, meant to give me clarity, were subtly dismissed as paranoia. And yet, the inconsistencies persisted. The gap between what I knew to be true and what I was told to accept widened with every passing hour. By late afternoon, I recognized a deliberate strategy. My parents and their associates were asserting control not through confrontation, but through erasure. My presence, my questions, my awareness, they were tolerated only to the extent that they did not threaten the curated narrative. My role had been minimized, diminished, reduced to a passive observer whose only option was compliance or invisibility. The weight of it settled in my chest, a quiet pressure I could neither speak nor release. And yet, I remained composed. Restraint had always been my shield, observation my advantage. I cataloged every interaction, every dismissal, every subtle manipulation. I watched the patterns, noted the contradictions, and absorbed the quiet truths they revealed. The gaslighting was effective, but only on the surface. Beneath it, I held the reality in my mind, clear, undeniable. By evening, the crescendo of subtle dismissal had left its mark. My questions remained unanswered. My observations questioned. My presence minimized. The gala, once a mere event, had become a microcosm of control, exclusion, and quiet psychological pressure. I felt the strain, yet I did not falter outwardly. I maintained my composure, aware that restraint was itself a form of power, that observation was more enduring than confrontation. For the first time, I understood the extent of the stakes. My family, the people I trusted implicitly, had begun to rewrite my reality, shape it to their convenience. And I, quiet and restrained, had begun the slow process of recognizing that their control was neither absolute nor invulnerable, but only if I allowed myself the clarity to see it. The next morning, the house felt different. Not overtly, not visibly, but the air carried a subtle shift, a tension layered beneath the usual rhythm. I moved quietly through the rooms, cataloging details as always, but now the inconsistencies were harder to ignore. Notes missing from my workspace, documents shuffled in ways I didn't authorize, hushed conversations abruptly ending when I entered a room. The red flags I had noticed earlier were no longer isolated. They were a pattern. It started with a slip. An assistant, distracted, left a folder partially open on my father's desk. I noticed the financial ledgers, investor notes, and seating arrangements for the gala that included names I had never heard associated with our family. My hands remained still. I did not reach for the papers. Observation, I reminded myself, was more powerful than confrontation. Yet the glimpse alone confirmed what I had begun to suspect. There were hidden systems in motion, carefully constructed, that I was deliberately excluded from. Later, I overheard a conversation between my mother and one of her advisors. The words were clipped, professional, but the intent was unmistakable. My presence was discussed as if I were a variable, a non-essential factor to be managed. I caught the phrase, "better if she's kept unaware," before the speaker noticed my shadow in the doorway. My stomach tightened, a quiet signal of betrayal that did not need to be shouted to exist. I cataloged it all silently, letting the reality sink in without outward reaction. That afternoon, I stumbled across a set of emails accidentally left visible on a shared tablet. The messages confirmed several of the anomalies I had noticed. Invitations I had been denied, strategic discussions from which I was deliberately excluded, and subtle remarks questioning my competence and understanding. The evidence was piecemeal, fragmented, yet unmistakable. I read carefully, absorbing details without reacting. Every sentence, every implication, every omission revealed layers of control and exclusion that had been hidden in plain sight. Even the staff contributed to the picture, though unintentionally. A housekeeper mentioned in passing a dinner conversation with an associate who had expressed surprise at my absence from a gala discussion. The slip was fleeting, almost apologetic, but it added to the mosaic of betrayal forming in my mind. Observing quietly, I realized that the truth was leaking through cracks in the carefully curated facade. My exclusion was deliberate. My trust had been violated. By evening, I had begun assembling the evidence in my own way. Notes, records, timelines, all cataloged meticulously. It wasn't enough for confrontation. I did not need it to be. The truth existed independently of acknowledgement, in the systems my parents and their associates had built, in the witnesses who inadvertently revealed fragments, in the documents and communications that could not be fully controlled. The realization was heavy, but it was mine, unshakable. Even as the evidence mounted, my parents continued their performance. Polished smiles, casual remarks, carefully modulated tones. They were unaware that I had begun to see through the illusions. Every gesture meant to control me, to maintain authority, only strengthened my awareness of the quiet power at my disposal. Observation, comprehension, restraint. I had become a spectator of their schemes, cataloging every slip, every intentional omission. I began to notice patterns more clearly. Invitations omitted, decisions preempted, conversations filtered. These were not mistakes. They were deliberate, strategic, designed to maintain control and preserve appearances. The evidence was partial, fragmented, yet persuasive. I could see the outlines of betrayal, and the quiet realization settled like a stone in my chest. I had been deceived, manipulated, and minimized for convenience and control. I did not confront them. I did not show recognition. The first glimpses of betrayal were dangerous, and I knew that restraint was my only armor. I observed silently, piecing together fragments from emails, conversations, and accidental disclosures. Each new detail added depth to the picture I had begun to form. The patterns of exclusion and manipulation were undeniable, and the quiet weight of awareness settled over me. By nightfall, the partial exposure had shifted my perspective entirely. The house no longer felt familiar or safe. Every gesture, every word, every carefully constructed scene had a dual meaning. The truth existed in the cracks of performance, in the fragments of evidence I had pieced together. The world I had trusted, the patterns I had relied upon, were no longer reliable. Betrayal existed here, quietly, deliberately, and irrevocably. And yet I remained still. Observation continued to be my strength. Restraint remained my shield. The pieces of truth, partial though they were, had illuminated the depth of manipulation and exclusion. The quiet evidence was clear. Trust had been broken, and the architecture of control, once invisible, was now undeniable. The realization was heavy, yet I carried it silently, aware that the true power of truth was in patience, in endurance, and in the knowledge that exposure, even partial, was only the first step toward consequence. The following morning, the house felt like it had changed its pulse. It wasn't loud or overt. It was in the subtleties, the quickening pace of staff movements, the sharpness in my parents' tones, the way every conversation seemed measured, calculated. I moved quietly, cataloging, observing, waiting. The partial exposures of the previous day had illuminated the scope of the betrayal, and now the response was beginning. Subtle, deliberate, invisible, like pressure building in the corners of a room. I noticed it first in the staff. Instructions I had been permitted to oversee or check now came filtered, delayed, or preemptively altered. Notes I had prepared were quietly removed from my workspace, replaced with new versions I had not authored. When I asked about discrepancies, the answers were clipped, polite, but dismissive, a subtle signal that the space I had once occupied was being redrawn without my knowledge. Observation alone revealed the intent. My exclusion was escalating. During breakfast, my mother casually mentioned the gala's seating arrangements, but there was something different in her tone. Where before she had assumed I would remain neutral, now there was an edge, a carefully restrained authority. Every phrase, every pause carried the unspoken message. "You do not belong here." My father, usually absorbed in financial reports or phone calls, made a passing remark that carried more weight than he intended. "You'll understand in time." I didn't speak. I merely noted the words, the tone, the subtle power in their delivery. The escalation became clear by mid-morning. A private meeting was convened with the staff, ostensibly about gala preparations. I was excluded. The doors closed silently, voices hushed, footsteps measured. Later, when questioned, the staff offered vague explanations, nothing intentional, they claimed, but the pattern was undeniable. My exclusion was deliberate, strategic, and expanding. The structures I had relied upon for observation were now actively being manipulated to limit my access. In the afternoon, I noticed another layer. A guest list, previously inaccessible, was placed where I could see it accidentally, a half-open folder on a side table. My heart did not race. My eyes did not widen. I cataloged silently. Names I recognized, names I did not, and beside them notes that suggested importance, priority, and influence, all carefully orchestrated. My exclusion was no longer a passive oversight. It was active, escalating in both reach and precision. The subtle pressure extended to communications as well. Emails I had once received directly were now routed through assistants. My questions were met with delayed responses, vague clarifications, or redirected entirely. It was a quiet suffocation, a tightening of control that left no room for confrontation. Every barrier, every omission, every delay was a deliberate act designed to remind me that I was on the outside of a carefully controlled world. By late afternoon, I observed my parents' behavior shift more visibly. My mother's smiles had a sharper edge, measured perfectly to disarm while asserting authority. My father's glances carried more weight, brief but precise, communicating dominance without words. I cataloged the interactions, noting the patterns, the adjustments in tone and gesture, the way power was exercised quietly but undeniably. The escalation was no longer subtle. It had become unavoidable, pressing against me like a wall of invisible force. Even the gala preparations reflected it. Decisions I had once anticipated or influenced were now executed without my input. The smallest details, seating arrangements, guest accommodations, even menu choices, were made in my absence, deliberately kept from me. I watched silently, recording, noting, understanding that my exclusion was not merely social. It was strategic, systematic, and escalating in intensity. By evening, the weight of it was undeniable. The partial exposures of evidence had become active manipulation. The red flags of yesterday were now constraints, subtle but real. The stakes were rising, and the people I trusted implicitly were orchestrating my exclusion with precision. I felt the quiet pressure, recognized the intent, and measured my response, observation and restraint. Confrontation now would be ineffective, perhaps dangerous. The power they wielded was invisible, systemic, and carefully maintained. Yet beneath the surface, I felt the subtle thrill of understanding. The escalation revealed the patterns in sharper relief. Their actions, though designed to limit me, also illuminated their weaknesses. The gaps between words, the inconsistencies in tone, the accidental slips, they all formed a map of control. I did not need to act immediately. The evidence was unfolding naturally. Patience, I reminded myself, was still my strongest tool. By nightfall, the house was quiet again, but the shift was permanent. I moved through the rooms with heightened awareness, cataloging the consequences of their escalation. The invisible walls were closing in, but I understood their structure. Observation had revealed the scope of the betrayal. Restraint ensured I remained beyond immediate harm. The stakes had risen sharply, but so had my clarity. The world I had trusted was cracking, and I was no longer naive. Escalation had arrived, not with confrontation, not with drama, but with precision, calculation, and quiet force. I remained still, restrained, observing every detail. The patterns were clear, the evidence accumulating, and the truth, though still incomplete, was beginning to dominate the space I had once assumed was safe. The stakes were high, the power imbalance stark, and the path forward required patience, composure, and an understanding of the quiet consequences that were already in motion. By morning, the weight of what I had observed settled into my chest like stone. Every detail, every slip, every omission I had cataloged over the past days now pressed against me with undeniable clarity. My parents, the people I had trusted implicitly, had been orchestrating a deliberate exclusion. Their control was precise, quiet, and relentless, and the world I had assumed was stable had become a terrain of manipulation and betrayal. The cracks I had glimpsed were no longer subtle. They were structural, running through everything I thought I understood. I could feel the first stirrings of anger, but I did not allow it to manifest outwardly. My hands were steady, my voice neutral, my posture unremarkable. I had learned long ago that power in their world was not exercised with overt force, but through systems, appearances, and consequences. I had seen the threads of control woven tightly around every interaction. To act rashly would be to give them the leverage they desired. Restraint, observation, patience, these were my tools, and I clung to them even as the emotional cost mounted. The breaking point was subtle. It arrived in fragments, a passing remark from my mother dismissing my understanding of a seating arrangement, a side glance from my father that spoke volumes, the realization that every communication I initiated was filtered, redirected, or ignored. I cataloged each incident silently, the quiet accumulation of evidence amplifying the betrayal. My trust, painstakingly built over years, had been dismantled with deliberate precision, and yet I remained composed. I understood that composure itself could be a quiet form of power. I spent the afternoon in the study, reviewing notes, timelines, and partial evidence I had collected. The fragments of truth were now coherent enough to form a map of manipulation, deliberate omissions, staged conversations, subtle gaslighting, and carefully constructed hierarchies of exclusion. The emotional weight of realization pressed down, a quiet ache that had no outlet. Every instinct told me to react, to confront, to demand acknowledgement. But I restrained myself. Every action in this world was measured. Every reaction could be weaponized. The moral cost was heavier than the emotional. I had always believed that justice required intervention, that betrayal demanded acknowledgement. But here, the stakes were not mere perception. They were systems, networks, and consequences that extended far beyond my immediate reach. I understood that to act impulsively would not only fail to deliver justice, but might expose me to harm or further marginalization. The realization was painful but necessary. Sometimes restraint, silence, and meticulous observation were the most powerful forms of response. By evening, the breaking point had crystallized. I accepted with quiet clarity the betrayal for what it was. It was deliberate, calculated, and systemic. My parents had chosen to exclude me, to manipulate my perception, and to maintain control. The emotional cost of this recognition was high, disappointment, hurt, and anger intertwined, but I acknowledged them internally without external display. The realization was heavy, yet grounding. Understanding the full scope of betrayal required clarity, not dramatics, endurance, not confrontation. I began to see the psychological consequences forming around me. My parents, in their meticulous orchestration, assumed compliance, trust, and ignorance. I had given them all three, consciously or not, for years. But now, awareness had shifted the balance. I could observe, document, and understand, even if I could not yet act. The power of knowledge, restrained and controlled, was heavier than the emotional surge of confrontation. My breaking point was not in anger, it was in recognition, in seeing clearly and choosing to endure. That night, the quiet ache persisted. I moved through the familiar spaces of the house, noting details I had previously ignored. The placement of furniture, the careful alignment of documents, the rehearsed gestures and glances. Each observation reinforced the truth. The world I had trusted had been designed to exclude me, but the truth remained mine to perceive. The choice to remain restrained was not surrender, it was strategy. Patience, observation and quiet endurance would preserve the advantage that overt reaction could destroy. By midnight, I understood the cost of acknowledgement. The betrayal was systemic, the exclusion deliberate, the manipulation precise. To confront now would invite consequences I could neither predict nor control. Instead, I chose restraint. I would endure the isolation, catalog the evidence, and wait for the natural consequences of the systems to unfold. Emotional restraint had never felt so heavy, yet so necessary. As I lay awake, the quiet realization settled fully. Trust could not be rebuilt here, at least not in the form I had once believed. I had seen the betrayal, recognized its scope, and felt its weight. The choice now was subtle, deliberate, and unspoken. Endurance over reaction, observation over confrontation, silence over engagement. The breaking point had arrived, not as a dramatic eruption, but as a quiet, resolute clarity that I would carry forward, no matter how heavy the cost. The morning arrived with no fanfare, but the air felt charged with subtle shifts. I had observed long enough to see patterns emerging, threads that now converged into consequences my parents could not fully control. The partial exposures I had documented, the evidence I had quietly collected, began to assert themselves in ways that could not be denied. Small cracks widened, and the invisible architecture of control they had relied upon started to falter, not through confrontation, not through spectacle, but through the inevitable logic of their own systems. It began with the staff. An assistant, in a moment of unguarded honesty, revealed details that contradicted what my parents had asserted. A phrase, a remark, a tiny slip, but enough to hint that my observations were not paranoia. I cataloged it silently, the quiet satisfaction of validation balanced against the weight of knowing how deliberate the earlier manipulations had been. The truth, though partial, was seeping through, undeniable even in its fragments. Later, I discovered another layer. A financial report, misfiled in a shared cabinet, contained annotations that confirmed decisions had been made without my knowledge, invitations redirected, and access deliberately withheld. The language was formal, bureaucratic, precise, yet it carried the evidence of deliberate exclusion. It was subtle, as all power in this household was, but it was enough. The systems my parents relied on to assert control had begun to reveal their cracks, and I was watching quietly as the truth edged toward exposure. During the afternoon, a family friend inadvertently confirmed what I had suspected. In conversation, they mentioned my absence from a meeting I should have attended. Their tone mingled with surprise and discomfort. The casual nature of the disclosure belied its significance, but I recognized it immediately. Witnesses, even unwitting ones, were now validating what had once been invisible to everyone but me. Observation and patience had brought the truth closer to clarity, and the consequences were beginning to manifest in small, quiet ways. By evening, the consequences extended into my parents' own sphere. Invitations for the gala, strategically planned, began to shift. Associates who had initially deferred to their authority began to ask questions, follow up on details, and hint at inconsistencies. The careful narrative my parents had constructed, the illusion of control, was quietly undermined, not through confrontation, but through the natural fallout of secrecy exposed to attentive observation. I did not intervene. I simply noted the patterns, recording the emergence of outcomes that had been set in motion long before. Even the gala itself, which had once seemed a fortress of exclusion, began to reflect the subtle consequences of mismanaged control. Arrangements shifted, priorities recalculated, and individuals who had been previously deferential started to act independently, guided by glimpses of truth I had quietly documented. The power balance, previously assumed immutable, began to tilt, not dramatically but perceptibly. I remained composed, allowing the shifts to unfold naturally, recognizing that overt action would be premature. The psychological weight of these consequences pressed on my parents, though they did not acknowledge it. Polished smiles became tighter, glances lingered longer, and the rehearsed gestures that had once communicated effortless authority now carried a tension I had not noticed before. I catalogued every nuance. Every slight misstep, every unguarded comment, every shift in the orchestration of appearances was a testament to the inevitability of consequence when deception and exclusion collided with observation and truth. By late evening, the quiet truth had become undeniable. The structures of control that my parents had relied upon were faltering under the weight of evidence, witness accounts, and the natural logic of the systems they had manipulated. The consequences were not public, they were not spectacular, but they were real. I observed each one with a measured awareness, recognizing that power does not always reveal itself in grand gestures. Sometimes it is revealed in the slow, unrelenting inevitability of consequence. As I moved through the house, noting every small adjustment, every shift in tone, I felt a quiet acknowledgement of the subtle reversal occurring. I had not acted. I had not spoken. I had only observed, catalogued, and restrained myself. And yet the consequences were unfolding in ways that could not be denied. The truth, once partial and hidden, had asserted itself quietly, irrevocably, and without spectacle. By nightfall, the aftermath of my parents' deliberate exclusions and manipulations was tangible in the air, in the staff, and in the subtle recalibration of priorities among associates. The consequences were neither celebrated nor dramatized. They existed as inevitable results of a system mismanaged. I observed it all silently, aware that recognition, even when it came, was often muted, subtle, and incomplete. And in that quiet observation, I felt the first sense of balance, not through action, but through the steady and undeniable unfolding of truth. The gala ended without ceremony, without acknowledgement of the shifts that had quietly taken place. Guests departed, conversations faded, and the polished halls returned to their familiar stillness. I moved through the empty rooms with deliberate calm, noting small details, the lingering scent of flowers, the faint clink of glasses left behind, the subtle adjustments in furniture that reflected last-minute decisions. Everything was as it had always been on the surface, yet underneath, the structure had changed. I did not speak of what I had seen. I did not demand recognition or validation. The truth, carefully observed and catalogued, existed quietly within me. My parents maintained their composed facades, unaware, or unwilling to acknowledge, that the systems they relied upon were no longer as absolute as they had believed. The guests, the staff, the associates, all returned to their routines, carrying fragments of the shift with them, unaware of the full picture. I lingered in the study, tracing the lines of documents I had reviewed, the emails, the notes, the subtle slips that had revealed the betrayal. The weight of awareness pressed gently, insistently, but I carried it without outburst. There was no victory, no celebration, no speech to mark the moment. Only the quiet recognition that the balance had shifted and that I had endured without exposing myself to unnecessary risk. Outside, the night had settled and the house was still. I stepped onto the balcony, the faint glow of city lights stretching into distance. The world continued as it always had, indifferent to the private truths unfolding within these walls. I allowed myself a deep breath, acknowledging the cost of understanding, the burden of observation, and the quiet power that came from restraint. In the end, nothing was proclaimed. Nothing was dramatized. The aftermath existed in subtle, permanent shifts, in access denied, in trust rebuilt elsewhere, in consequences quietly unfolding. I remained, as always, present but restrained, watching the world continue, aware that some truths are heaviest when carried silently.